Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on polymorphic justice and the crisis of the international order. I'm Christian Roux-Smit. I'm a professor at the University of Queensland, and I'm one of the co-editors of the special section of international affairs that addresses the relationship between injustice and the crisis in international affairs. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today for this webinar that will focus on one particular aspect of the special issue. I want to let everybody know that this event is on the record and the webinar is being recorded. So please take note of that. The special section that we're talking about today addresses what the contributors consider to be one of in a sense, a neglected dimension of the contemporary crisis of international order. And this is the dimension of justice. The present international order, we argue, is subjected to multiple claims of injustice. And more than these just being multiple claims of injustice, claims to distributional injustice, claims to recognitional injustice, claims to institutional injustice, claims to historical justice, claims to intergenerational justice, but these justice dimensions of the politics of justice interact and connect in complex ways. And we've coined the term the polymorphic politics of justice to try to capture this sense of the interconnectedness of the multiple justice claims that are being leveled against the contemporary international order. Now, this particular event, we're going to focus in on one of these dimensions or one of these kinds of justice claims that are being leveled at the contemporary order, and that is institutional injustice. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome my two presenters in this webinar, Terry McDonald, who is an associate professor at the University of Melbourne, and Catherine Liu, who is professor of political science at McGill University, who are both experts on different dimensions of questions of institutional justice and international relations. And they have written particularly powerful contributions to our special section of international affairs. And it's a great pleasure to have them here to discuss the ideas that they advance in those pieces, but also to reflect on their contributions to the broader special issue on justice and the crisis of international order. What we're going to be doing today in this event, we're going to begin by our two authors giving us a brief presentation on the nature of their contributions to the special section, the arguments that they've mobilized, the special approaches they've taken to institutional injustice and the crisis of international order. And that'll be roughly about 5 minutes each. Then what we're going to do is that I'm going to ask them a number of questions, and then we will turn to questions and answers from the audience. And it promises to be a really exciting discussion today. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to the first of our authors, and that is Terry McDonald.
Hello, thanks so much for coming to join this conversation with us today. So my contribution to this special issue addresses the question of global institutional justice understood as principles for the design of legitimate governance institutions for the global political order. So that's the dimension of the political order that are addressed by institutional justice, as I understand it in my contribution. Institutional justice is the label that we're all using collectively in this conversation, but these kinds of principles of design for governance institutions and their legitimation goes by other names too. Political justice is one that I use in this particular article. And these principles are sometimes talked about as political justice because they're principles of justice that are devised for the political sphere of collective action undertaken through the authoritative rules and decision-making processes of governance institutions. That's why that concept of the political and political justice comes into play. This is a really familiar and politically significant dimension of justice. So the pursuit of institutional justice understood in this way, it's at the heart of a lot of domestic liberal and democratic political practices internal to states, and many of the political innovations and political revolutions within states through the modern era have been centred on this dimension of justice claims, the design of liberal constitutions, democratic decision-making processes, and larger systems of political accountability and participation and collective self-determination as these are understood in diverse ways within different cultural traditions. This is institutional justice. This is the kind of institutional political justice I'm concerned with here. The difficulty in international relations is that, of course, in global politics, governance processes have to take place without this constitutional framework of a state, as analogous to what we have in domestic state-based political orders. So the principles of institutional design and practices of legitimation need to be thought about differently in the international context from the domestic political context. And what this paper is concerned with is the question of how we should think about those design principles of political justice. So this isn't a new question. It's obviously been really central to the debates about institutional design that have been going on for hundreds of years, but the models of governance and legitimation that have been consolidated through the 20th century in the development of the framework of state sovereignty, national self-determination, democratic empowerment at the level of states, the evolution of global human rights practices, as well as the international institutions of the UN system for addressing common problems on agreed terms among those self-determining states. This is the institutional model that we've inherited in the 21st century from all the work that's been done on this this dimension of justice in preceding generations. And this is often talked about as a model of international legitimacy centered on the idea of pluralist internationalism. So pluralist in the sense that there's a plurality of self-determining states and nations through which political justice is pursued domestically, and we have internal legitimacy centered on those collective self-determination ideals. And then internationally, we have our parallel track of international governance and human rights principles that provide a common framework of external legitimacy for those states. That's the model we've inherited. And that model still delivers legitimate governance in many institutional spheres with varying degrees of strength at the present time. But it's subject to increasing challenge, and some would even say legitimacy crisis in a lot of contexts. There are many reasons for this. It's, of course, a very complex political system, and there are many intersecting dynamics that drive these legitimacy crises, ideological challenges to liberalism, new rising powers outside of the Western liberal democracies that have shaped that 20th century international order, rising economic inequalities, both domestically and internationally, and so on. These developments each have their own internal dynamics, but they're bound up in a more macro level shift towards complex transnational interdependence on a global scale as a result of deepening complexities in transnational social, economic, and cultural connections. And this results in the need for, and a lot of political advocacy towards, stronger transnational processes of governance and legitimacy. And that's what I try to document and examine and develop in the theoretical contribution in this piece. The article illustrates these challenges by looking at the claims of three prominent activist communities that are mobilising to advance global political justice through reforming and legitimising governance institutions in different issue areas. Refugee communities who are mobilising in the area of migration governance transnationally, communities affected by the environmental impacts of climate change, working in environmental governance institutions, both at local levels and at international and transnational levels, and workers in the supply chains of the transnational economy, working on reforming labour regulation, again, within local, transnational and global governance processes. And these movements are trying to transform the way we think about political justice in dimensions of governance capability, developing new forms of governance capability outside of that international state-based order that have better problem-solving capability in these issue areas, developing new conceptions of political community, which are more transnational, where community is integrated through more dynamic and open forms of shared interest and solidarity, quite different from the closed territorial cultural units of the international transnationalist political imagination. And third, they're developing and advocating new models of political participation that don't just take the form of voice or vote in public debate and formal institutional decision-making processes, but also centre on more direct forms of autonomy in the management of service and infrastructures at local levels, in workplaces, refugee camps, local environments and communities that shape people's lives across the global order. So in the piece, I examine these claims about global justice, and then in the final section, try to extrapolate from them and systematize these insights and these ideas about political justice through re-articulating a conception of what global political justice might look like in this transnationalist era of the 21st century. And the label that I put on this reimagined framework of global justice moves from pluralist internationalism to the idea of complex pluralist governance and legitimacy. And this imagines a future of reinvigorated collective self-determination and democratization, extending beyond the boundaries of states and nations, empowering new forms of political collaboration and collective decision-making within cities and rural localities, across transnational workplaces and supply chains, and through activist networks of solidaristic global citizens taking shared responsibility for their common political fate. That's the model. I think I've used my time, so I'll hand that over to Catherine.
Thank you, Terry. That's fantastic. And yeah, over to you, Catherine. Catherine, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation, Terry, and also for Christian and for the organizers, especially Isabel at Chatham House, for inviting me to give a brief talk, I guess, about my article, Progress, Decolonization, and Global Justice. I should admit that this paper was in a way started by reading the article by Christian Roy-Smith and Aisha Zerikol, in which they discussed the polymorphic claims of justice that are central to the crisis of contemporary international order. And they spelled out, I think, very well the different forms of justice, distributional, recognitional, historical, intergenerational, as well as institutional. And I wanted to think a little bit about, well, what is the political productivity of crisis, right? So rather than looking at crisis as something to freak out about, I thought, well, crises can be morally and politically productive. And so let's think about it from that perspective. And here I started then to go back to a genre that I've always been very interested in myself, the genre of tragedy. And I wanted to think about what a tragic view could help us with in terms of orienting ourselves to the contemporary crises of international order. And I think the tragic genre helps us in several ways. First, in my article, I explained that one thing that the tragic perspective shows you is that there are multiple views of social reality. So while some people experience contemporary crisis of international order, others may have experienced it for a long time already. So, whose crisis and when something becomes a crisis is itself already a political product. And so this is why my article starts with Chief Levy General's attempt. He's the deske or speaker of the Six Nations Council. His attempt 100 years ago in 1923, he goes to Geneva to try to get the League of Nations to listen to his arguments that Canada was basically disturbing the international peace. And of course, Canada at the time was doing various things in order to forward a settler colonial project and fortify the Canadian state by erasing Indigenous sovereignty. So, part of my article is also showing that in terms of the institutional justice that we see in the order that Terry very well laid out at the beginning of her talk, we can see that from its beginning, its constitutional beginnings, there were already claims of justice. They were already there. Indigenous peoples were already trying to argue that it was unjust towards them. However, as we know, tragically, Deske did not get an adequate hearing at the League of Nations, and therefore Indigenous sovereignty did not come to be recognized, in the institutions of the statist international order that developed to the one that we have today. So one of the points about the tragic narrative is often when you read tragedies, you see these marginalized characters, and they're often speaking truths and suffering, unmerited suffering, and yet usually the powerful can't see it. So it's also very clear in tragic narratives how those who have power can be dismissive and blind to those who have those claims. And I think it's not. It was intentional, I should say, that I decided to write this piece also in the shadow of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I think here we see, of course, the international community somewhat understanding that this is a challenge to the current international order. After all, a sovereign state that existed for 30 years was now being attacked by another state. But I also wanted to show that there are similarities of that claim of justice of Ukrainians and the claim of indigenous peoples to self-determination. And I think tragedy helps us also see that, to raise questions about why we might have different responses to these very similar types of violations of self-determination, and how we can be more consistent if we see that the violation of Ukraine is a deep injustice to the self-determination of Ukrainians, why we may also want to question our inability to recognize the self-determination of indigenous peoples at the level of international order. Now, another thing that I think the multiple perspectives helps us to see from a tragic narrative is that tragedies often focus on the powerful and their moments of tragic recognition. So in several tragic plays that you can think of, whether it's say Creon and Antigone, or various other Agamemnon, in the Aristeia trilogy, there are moments of recognition where the main protagonist realizes that the order they've produced is not the one they intended, and usually they suffer some tragic reversal. So here I argue that if we are to understand and interpret the contemporary crisis of international order, we can also look at the proponents of that order, and how it is that they can recognize this tragic reversal. So we can see that the many claims of justice that have become more vocal in a context of what many have called a kind of liberal international order, I think that label is, deficient in some ways, as Christian and Aisha mentioned. Some people also call it a rules-based international order. Again, I think that's very deficient in many ways, but at least this was the image that many proponents of international order had in their minds of the international order. I think that we can see that tragic reversal means that people who were proponents of that order, or that image of international order, have come to see that that's not the order that they have produced. And this tragic recognition, I argue, is productive. Rather than seeing justice as a problem of recognition of, say, the marginalized by the powerful, we can see the tragic genre as precipitating a recognition of the powerful, of their own failings, or of their own marginality, or just of their own incoherence, right? And that kind of recognition, I think, is much more powerful for progress. So I just want to end with saying that the article then really tries to say that that through tragedy we can understand what progress might mean. It's not the positive, linear enlightenment view of progress towards a known destination. Rather, progress comes from recognizing where we are, which is usually not where we are where we think we are in a kind of idealized form. But I think the recognition of where we are is a very good starting point for thinking through real problems and for recognizing the problems that are often obscured and muffled and silenced in world politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Terry, for really terrific overviews of your very rich articles and contributions to the special section. I just wonder if I can draw you back to the question of polymorphic justice, which is the kind of core concept that we've developed for the special issue, which really is not just about the multiple nature of the claims to justice that exist today, distributional, institutional, recognitional, historical, intergenerational, etc., but also about how these intersect with each other in complex ways and how they are occurring across multiple scales. So that what's interesting is that we're not just talking about a politics of justice that's occurring at the international level, as we understand it as relations between sovereign states, but also at the domestic level and the transnational levels. And these are intersecting and overlaying and interacting in very complex ways. I wonder if I could draw you out on the degree to which you think that concept is useful to you in thinking about the particular focus you have, albeit different approaches to the question of institutional justice. And I wonder if I could begin with asking Terry for her thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Look, I think this is an extremely useful framework, and I actually think it sits in a particularly, it's particularly congenial for a pluralist approach to thinking about political justice. The reason for that is I think a lot of influential political thinking about justice through the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in liberal democratic intellectual communities, tended to think about justice in a holistic structural way. The idea that the purpose of a theory of justice or a set of principles of justice was to come up with moral principles to regulate the basic structure of an entire political order in a holistic sense. That was associated with the theory of justice of the political theorist John Rawls, and has a longer intellectual heritage dating back to the work of Kant on these issues. I think the idea of polymorphic justice encourages us to think in a different way. And I think the way that Catherine put it at the end of her comments was actually very helpful. The idea that we should begin our inquiry into justice by reflecting on the nature of the problems that we face in the non-ideal world that we inhabit. One of the things that I think we find if we reflect on that political situation is that we don't face one problem of injustice, we face many. And what would count as a resolution for one can sometimes sit in some tension with the kinds of reforms and institutions that might count as a solution to the others. And sitting with those tensions and reflecting on those tensions, I think, exactly as Catherine says, has to be a really important part of the intellectual work we do in confronting these challenges. Political justice, as I understand it, is a set of principles that respond to problems of legitimacy. Problems of legitimacy are a very particular kind of political problem that arise when we live a collective life under conditions of interdependence, such that we have common problems, common opportunities. We need some shared governance framework to manage those in productive ways. And yet that happens alongside normative disagreement. We don't all share the same kinds of moral, religious commitments. We don't all share the same kinds of material interests. There are normative conflicts there that need to be resolved in the design and the management of those governance institutions. That's what legitimacy, that's what principles of political justice are concerned with, problems of legitimacy. But that's just one dimension of justice. That operates in these public spheres of collective action and collective decision-making through institutional rule. But a lot of the problems where just injustices arise in other kinds of spheres and relations, in the private spheres of the economy and the culture, where recognitional claims and distributional claims arise, and where the epistemic claims of justice associated with the construction of knowledge arise, and also in relations between those of us who inhabit the present with our collective action and agency and the moral relations to the past and the future in those historical intergenerational dimensions of justice. So I think the idea of polymorphic justice is very helpful in reminding us, as we think through and try to systematize our models of political justice and governance and legitimacy, that this is only one dimension, and whatever commitments we arrive at in that sphere of action need to be looked at alongside these other moral relationships and challenges. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Terry. Catherine, your thoughts on this?
Yes, if I can maybe speak to the case of indigenous activism towards settler colonial states. I think it is significant that indigenous peoples, while they are involved in local struggles, many local struggles against pipelines, against various types of development, they also have organized at the international level, and we can see things such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as one outcome of that, right? So I think Indigenous thinkers such as Glenn Coulthard have written that for example, the liberal democratic state of Canada, a settler colonial state, is one that tries to offer multicultural recognition, but which is inadequate, right, to the claims of Indigenous peoples, which is really not a claim for recognition of equality based on just being a plural, number of another group of people in Canada, but a group that is a distinct self-determining group that should be recognized as peoples and able to govern affairs and enjoy sovereignty. So I think that Indigenous claims often do intersect domestic, international, partly because the state system, first of all, was unjustly imposed on them, and second, the actual international borders that sovereign states claim actually go through many Indigenous traditional groups and territories. So even, I'm actually in Berlin, Germany right now, but if I were at McGill in Montreal, certainly groups of the Six Nations, of the Haudenosaunee peoples, their traditional territories traverse the United States and Canada, and my story about Chief Levy General Desque is partly about how he's not able to go home after visiting Geneva, because he doesn't have a Canadian passport, right? So these are very specific ways, I think, in which Indigenous peoples experience the contemporary international order as unjust and alienating, and how that leads then to calls, I think, to recognize Indigenous self-determination is actually requires quite profound changes to the constitutional architecture of the sovereign state system, including the right of states to, for example, control their territory, without recognition of Indigenous claims, for example.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm just wondering if I could also pose another question to the two of you. And this is really, a listener might say, well, this is all very interesting. You're describing a complex politics of justice. And yes, we can acknowledge that this is occurring and that there are many injustices in world politics. But how exactly does this relate to the crisis of the contemporary international order, particularly with respect to institutional justice in injustice, as the two of you have discussed it in your papers? So in a sense, it's to get you to bring that back. And you both touched on this in your presentations, but I wonder if I could get you to say a few more words on how you connect the politics of justice back to the crisis of order with particular reference to institutional justice. Perhaps Terry first.
Thank you. No, that's a really good question. And I think the domain of political justice is one where I think the connection to crisis of international order is perhaps particularly strong. And the reason for that is, again, it's connected to this non-ideal pragmatic character of the value of legitimacy itself. I think, and again, this goes back to the point I made before, that a lot of thinking about justice, particularly the sort of liberal idealist approaches to thinking about justice over the last century, have had utopian dimensions to them. The idea that we reflect in some kind of abstracted hypothetical moral domain about what an ideally just society would look like. And then we translate that into an institutional design for the political world. That's one way of thinking about justice. The idea of legitimacy is not like that. It's a very different kind of political value. And I think the idea of institutional justice is bound up with the pursuit of legitimacy. It's a very pragmatic value that begins with, as Catherine said it should, that begins with an understanding of what our political situation and what the predicaments that we face in that situation are really like, in all of their non-ideal difficulty and complexity. And so the way that I think about legitimacy is it's a value that we've devised, particularly through the modern era, to deal with a very specific kind of predicament, one where we are bound together in this forced interdependence. Our various forms of social, cultural, economic connection and mutual vulnerability in the modern era force us to come together and come up with some kind of agreed institutional rules to govern our very complex modern lives. We have to do that despite deep cultural, moral disagreement and difference in the kinds of lives that we want to live, the kinds of interests that we have in virtue of those lives, and the kinds of moral and religious ideals that we want to uphold in the pursuit of those lives. There are big normative disputes that we have to manage alongside this cooperative, collaborative governance through institutions. The problem of legitimacy tells us how to do that. It sets in place either a set of substantive commitments to ideas like human rights or certain kinds of sort of functional goods that we want to pursue, peace and development and so on, as through the UN, some of the institutions of the UN system, as well as procedures that, notwithstanding our normative disagreements, we can all agree that certain kinds of decision-making procedures are fair and that we can commit ourselves to be bound by the outcomes. That's what ideas of legitimacy do for us. And as a result of that, they give us standards that we can use to commit to support for institutions, even when their rules aren't our preferred ones, and even when the outcomes that they're generating aren't ideal in terms of our interests or our moral values. So the crises of the international order, I think there are many, but one of them is very much a legitimacy crisis. More and more there are communities, constituencies within the global community that are saying these institutions aren't serving us. The rules that are governing the decision-making processes, the terms of participation, the kinds of outcomes that these institutions are producing aren't good enough to warrant the kinds of sacrifices that we're being asked to make, the forms of submission and compliance and deference to their rules, the forms of financial contributions to their functioning and so on, are not worth it. And so it's a legitimacy crisis. Legitimacy gives standards of support worthiness for institutions. And if we don't solve the problem of legitimacy, that support will wane. And that's where we see non-compliance, that's where we see administrative weak capability and so on developing. So I would tie it to the legitimacy crisis and the functional deficits and disordering effects that they have in the global order.
Thank you, Terry. Catherine?
Thank you. I think that is a very difficult question, but which will allow me to bring in maybe the third part of my article, which is that I think decolonization or the call for decolonizing international order can be read as a call for tragic progress. And here the idea is that decolonization is a fundamental rethink that is precipitated by crisis. This is a rethink about, for example, claims to universality, claims to the rule of law, claims to human rights. Decolonization requires us to question how these have been practiced, especially in the last 30 years, and who they've benefited and who has been left out. And I think when we do that, we can connect then the crisis to contemporary challenges of climate change. I quoted in the article from the Red Nation, a consortium of activists and for Indigenous rights in their manifesto, The Red Deal, right, where they talk about how decolonization is not just a negative sort of, let's burn it all to the ground type of enterprise. They say that it has a positive vision. And I just quote from them, they say, "We are for Indigenous life, for the life of all human and other than human beings. In order to live dignified lives, we must heal ourselves from the destruction caused by colonialism and capitalism, by stopping what harms us and desecrates our land, and instead begin to build what will sustain us. You know, when you hear that vision, it shouldn't sound it should sound appealing to everyone. And yet I think it does show, just like the slogan Black Lives Matter, it does test some people who perhaps have devalued Indigenous lives as fated to extinction, or you know, how Black Lives Matter disturb some people who think basically that Black people are inferior. So I think that these are very disorienting types of movements, because they really call into question some of the fundamental underlying ideologies that have sustained our contemporary international order: white supremacy, anti-Indigenous civilizational discourse. And so I think that decolonization is an imperative to trying to see our institutions in a real light, and to therefore really start the kinds of reforms that are necessary for all lives to flourish.
Thank you, Catherine. At this point, what I'd like to do is to turn our attention to some of the questions that have been asked from the audience. And I would encourage members of the audience to post their questions so that we can have a chance in the remaining time to answer as many as possible. And I'd like to begin actually with a question from Simon. And Simon asks, how do you reconcile the fundamental structural shifts you're describing with the urgency of climate action? My concern is that the pursuit of climate justice as part of this broader and deeper justice agenda, including institutional justice, could be a barrier to progress in the less than 10-year timeframe that we have. Now, I would just, before I turn this over to Terry and to Catherine for their thoughts, I would just note that we actually have two articles that address the question of climate justice and the crisis of the international order, one by Robin Eckersley and one by Sandeep Sengupta. And I would strongly recommend Simon, you and others who are interested in this question to have a look at those pieces. But I wonder if Terry, if you have any thoughts, or Catherine, if you have any thoughts in response to Simon's question.
Yeah, thank you. Look, that's a fantastic question, and I think it's a really good one in highlighting some of the the limiting conditions for the salience of these kinds of principles of political justice. So, and I think this follows from, I sort of think about the grounds of these kinds of normative claims about justice in a pragmatic way. So I think, you know, if you're not going to approach these questions by thinking in terms of transcendental moral ideals that we then apply to political life, you have to have a different view of a starting point. And for me as a pragmatist, the starting point is in the salience of the problem. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of situations in modern political life where it's been a widely held view that this problem of how to support collective action, what are the kinds of common standards that we can agree on to give us all sufficient reason to support shared institutions, a commitment that's required for those institutions to function in the service of the common good. That has been a very salient problem in many places at many times, and certainly in the international order itself. It won't always be the most salient problem. And I think one of the ideas, one of the binaries that framed this whole special issue was this sort of very familiar contrast between order and justice. And certainly in the history of political thought on legitimacy, this has been a central tension. When we're thinking about legitimacy and trying to identify what are the standards that make our institutions worthy of our support and commitment and sacrifice and compliance, what is the role of these moral aspirations, these loftier moral ideals of justice on the one hand, versus a concern for some sort of a less morally ambitious perhaps, but perhaps more materially pressing concern with order, which obviously at certain periods of modern history has been focused very much on violence, the problem of violence and peace, and how to achieve that as a starting place for a cooperative political life. But in the context of climate change and environmental crisis, there's a different kind of material pressure that you identify, the urgency of addressing this potential environmental catastrophe. Although the nature of that material pressure and constraint is different when we're talking about environmental crisis versus catastrophic war, I think the restraining influence of that concern over the loftier moral ideals of justice is quite analogous. And so I see that definitely as a limiting condition on the salience of these sorts of procedural participatory principles. Catherine, turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Simon. I think it's very difficult, but perhaps we're going to find out sooner rather than later, given climate catastrophes that already have happened and are happening and most likely will continue to happen. That's from a tragic perspective, these catastrophes are foreseeable, and I suppose the hope of a philosopher like me is to say, well, since we can see it coming, we don't have to live the tragedy necessarily in order to see that there are things we should do differently, right? So the prospective tragic outcome that might happen is certainly one way that we can motivate ourselves to perhaps transform institutions. But I fear that the problem of the way that climate change has produced effects is that often those who are most responsible for emissions aren't the ones who necessarily are going to face the immediate catastrophe. So there's a great human capacity to compartmentalize catastrophes and to not think of the Earth, for example, as one bounded unit that is interdependent and will ultimately be affected by things that happen in many different corners of the world. But I think, again, that this is why it does have to be a kind of global effort. And I guess the tragic perspective tells us that perhaps if those who are powerful do suffer certain catastrophes, that might prompt them to actually do something. Of course, it might by then be too late, and that's one of the difficulties of a tragic genre, right? Is that the end is often full of suffering, even if we may gain some wisdom from it in the end, or some of us may gain some wisdom in the end.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll move now to another question. And this one brings us back, in a sense, to the question of violence that Terry mentioned earlier. And this is a question from, please excuse me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, from Abuide, who asks, how does the invasion of Ukraine and the inability of the UN to maintain order and provide justice to indigenous Ukrainians, how does this relate to what we're speaking about now? I think this could be reframed as really getting at that question of the failure of the UN. Where does institutional justice lie in the context of the Ukrainian conflict, particularly with respect to Ukrainians on the ground? And I wonder if either of you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is obviously, it's a very difficult question. I certainly wouldn't claim to have the answer. I mean, I think it does come back to these old questions about, how much can we aspire to beyond that very minimal threshold of securing peace from violence on the one hand, security from violence, peace, and how should we trade the pursuit of peace, security from violence off against the kinds of loftier ideals that give a deeper meaning and purpose to our individual and collective lives. They're really foundational questions, I think, in any kind of conversation about justice and the way that we articulate it in relation to this other value of order that sits in the background. I think one of the difficulties with 20th century thinking, particularly sort of latter 20th century liberal thinking about justice, is that this problem of order is kind of backgrounded, that a lot of the ideal theoretic thinking about justice and political justice in terms of democratization and this sort of perfection of the liberal democratic institutional form takes for granted. It's a very sort of indulgent, privileged sort of political discourse about justice because it's only able to take place against the background of a political situation in which that problem of violence has, at least temporarily, been solved, at least for some. For those sitting in their philosophy departments in North America and some parts of Western Europe during that particular historical era, it was perhaps comfortable for the people theorising about justice at that time and in those places to put that problem of order in the background as something we could take for granted. And in fact, that's how Rawls, the great liberal philosopher of justice, John Rawls, in fact began there. You know, justice is something that we theorise in the context of a particular kind of liberal democratic political order. Of course, in the context of international order, we've rarely had that luxury. The threat and the reality of war has nearly always been with us, and for some, you know, always with us in international sphere. And obviously at this time, it's one that's particularly prominent and salient. We can't escape from confronting that threat of violence, the reality of violence for many. And I think those old questions about, you know, how do we prioritize the pursuit of peace and achieving a life free from violence, where life is nasty, brutish and short, as Hobbes said, obviously, in those early theories of state sovereignty. How do we trade those off against the fight for these higher ideals of collective self-determination, of self-determination for Indigenous peoples in Ukraine, in Canada, in Australia, elsewhere around the world? I don't have the answers to those questions, but I think they're exactly the questions we need to be asking. And I think this polymorphic framework for thinking about justice really encourages us to keep those tensions and trade-offs very much at the forefront of our thinking, instead of reverting back to these, you know, more utopian kinds of forms of theoretical thinking.
Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. The UN's failure, I mean, it's a statist organization, so one would think that it would be at the forefront of condemning violations of rules of its own order, and in some ways, you know, in some ways it has. However, of course, the UN Security Council has been, you know, disabled in the sense because of the fact that the powers on the Security Council have veto powers. I do think that this is an opportunity to think about, you know, what kind of structural changes we might want to see in international order, you know, in this century. We clearly have an international order in which there are still great powers. I want to raise the problem that we should no longer call them great powers. The word great sounds wonderful, you know, like this movie was great, but this is not actually what great powers do in world politics. Often great powers have a problem with a world that is becoming more polymorphic, a world that is becoming more equal, and they have the hardest time relinquishing their great power status. So I think we should also understand Russia's actions, which are, you know, abhorrent, but in a context in which they are struggling to maintain a great power status or assert a great power status in a world that actually still does recognize that great power status means something. And so I think in order to deflate Russian aspirations, we do need fundamental international structural change. The analogy I can think of is about World War I in Germany, right? Where after Germany loses World War I, the new League of Nations run by imperial power says, you know, Germany, you're too barbaric and uncivilized. You've committed genocide against the Hero and the Nama, so we're going to deprive you of colonies because you're a bad civilizer. But we're okay, you know, the British and the French, we can continue, you know, the mandate system and help other peoples become more civilized. But to me, this was the fundamental problem. You know, you say to a country that has been not completely defeated, but certainly has lost the war, that it cannot maintain great power status and it cannot have the instruments of great power status. well, if you still have a world order that rewards great powers, then it's in some ways logical for those powers to try to regain that status, right? And so here I would say the best way to deflate Russia would be, and to destroy its imperial ambitions, is to create a world in which there are no great powers and where no country can assume that it is a hegemonic country that can dictate terms to others. This obviously is a long-term enterprise, but I think this is why the struggle in Ukraine is so important. How much can the world stand with Ukraine to say, yes, this is not a world that we want, a world in which great powers can say to their neighbors, you mean nothing, you don't exist, and we can swallow you up with no consequences.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we've got time for one more question. We've got a little more than 5 minutes, but I'm going to state this question quickly and then get your quick responses to this. I think this is an important question, actually. Dia asks, to what extent do you think the emerging non-Western global South and middle powers like Indonesia or India could potentially help improve institutional justice, for example, through their roles in the recent G20 presidency? What should these emerging powers do in their national level and in multilateral institutions themselves? Now, that's a huge question, but I wonder if I could ask you both for some very quick thoughts as we wrap up this session. Terry?
Oh, look, I mean, I think the contributions of these states are absolutely central, to the evolution, absolutely fundamental to it, the evolution of our frameworks of institutional justice. And I think many of the institutional legitimacy crises that are emerging are associated with the fact that, on the one hand, the balance of power within these institutions still lies with the great powers and the Western allies that set up this liberal institutionalist, or whatever you want to call it, status quo institutional framework that we've inherited from the 20th century. And so the balance of power and interest within those institutions is, of course, one important source of legitimacy crisis. But the cultural baggage, I think, that's bound up in the fact that many of these ideas that have a liberal intellectual heritage, they derive from particular cultural traditions that are not shared and are not endorsed by those elsewhere around the world. And yet these kinds of problems that drive the need for legitimacy, problems of interdependence and normative dispute and the need to resolve those disputes, these are problems that are experienced not only in Europe and North America and the places where many of the sort of canonical works of political theory that underpin this thinking about legitimacy have originated, but there are obviously rich intellectual traditions of thinking around these problems that need to be, I think, brought into this conversation about political legitimacy and its grounds, and the way in which we should reason together about what political justice should look like in a pluralistic, polymorphic global political order. So I think at both of those levels of analysis, the more realist and the more sort of normative, I think the involvement of these states is going to be central to solving these problems.
Thank you, Terry. Catherine, a few thoughts?
Yes, very well. I think very quickly, I think Indonesia, India, middle powers, the global South have a huge role to play. And I would just say that historically, we should remember that they have played already huge roles. I mean, I think it's just a simplification to think about, for example, the Cold War as one that was in which all politics everywhere was dominated by the Soviet Union and the United States and the Western Bloc. Right? We know that the non-aligned movement, the Afro-Asian movement, the Pan-Islamic movement, all these point out that, in fact, those who are not the hegemons have agency. I think it's very important that every actor has political agency of some sort. It's not equal, it's not necessarily effective, but but many different world leaders throughout the Cold War were thinking about how to think about the new world order. They offered different visions of a world order, an alternative to the Cold War, for example, that was dominated by the superpowers. So I think we live in a time now, again, where basically the United States and Russia have shown themselves in a way to be very much failed states. They are failing powers. They are failing great powers. This precipitates thinking on the part of those who are not considered great powers to seek alternative views, to seek alternative ways of realizing and solving problems, and as they have historically, right? And so I think what we can do as academics, but also as citizens of different countries and areas, is to pay attention to our local politics, pay attention to what is the political system, and how can we help effectively to change it in ways that dismantle domination and that can help resolve international conflicts. Historically, these countries have played major roles, and I think they can continue to do so.
Just a further note on that, just to reinforce Catherine's point, I think it's, there is now an immense amount of scholarship that shows just how important post-colonial states were in shaping even the core institutions of what came to be understood as the post-1945 international order, the Bretton Woods institutions, the international human rights regime. All of these were shaped by precisely the states that Dia has mentioned. India, Indonesia played really important roles in those processes. And so I think this is, as Catherine said, I think this is, we need to think of this not only as there being an opportunity today, but there being a long history of the agency of these states in both shaping and legitimizing key aspects of the international order. I'm looking to see that we have no more online questions. I wonder if there's anything. I'll give Terry and Catherine an opportunity. If there's anything, finally, a very quick word that they might like to offer before we close. Terry?
Oh, I don't think, maybe Catherine would like to go first.
Okay.
For this one.
Catherine.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Christian, for this wonderful program, and Isabel and Ria and Terry also for being my conversationalist. It was really great to talk with you and about the problems of international order. My last thing I want to say is I guess a plug for the tragic progress perspective, which is to say that we can recognize that, in many ways, we already are, in the abyss. We have already committed, we live in a world in which genocide, slavery, all sorts of atrocities are still ongoing and have been experienced and are being experienced. And yet I think the question is, how do we ally ourselves with those who are experiencing these struggles to make progress out of dispossession and genocide and slavery? And I think that this is important, that there is possibility. And the last thing I want to say about tragic progress is that it's not minimalist. I think from tragedy, we can soar to great heights of progress, but we have to, first of all, recognize, I think, where we are to be able to make that progress.
Okay, not to put you on the spot, Terry, did you have anything you wanted to offer here?
Yeah, I'll jump off that, because I think this coming back to this this approach, how do we think about these questions? Not necessarily what answers do we offer, because I think many more voices need to contribute in thinking through, particularly about institutional justice, which is all about collective agency and collective self-determination. But in terms of how do we frame the conversation, that's something where I think as theorists we have something useful and distinctive to contribute. And I think this tragic approach that Catherine's talking about, and a sort of a more pragmatic approach that I favour, I think they're very closely aligned. But I think what they do is they point to the need for normative theorists or ethicists or whatever you want to call people who think about justice in a systematic way, need to have more systematic and sustained dialogues with people who do empirical work about, understanding the sort of causal explanatory dynamics of what's going on, and the practitioners who are, thick in the practice of that work. There's been an unproductive tendency, I think, over the last few decades of scholarship on international politics to separate these conversations and to put questions of justice into these spheres where just sort of, philosophers and their pipe dreams sort of talk to each other in a sort of very non-consequential way, and are largely ignored by those who are doing the real work of driving political decision-making in offices of power and so on. I think that's very problematic, to think of questions of justice as being utopian questions or unrealistic questions or idealistic questions. I think they're very much at the heart of many of the collective political movements, the activist movements, the self-determination movements that have been agents of political change and development through history, as I think the two of you rightly said in your comments. And I think thinking about justice in more realistic terms, analysing the forms of agency that advance justice, and in particular thinking about how we can empower those forms of political agency in our local political practices is so crucial as an intellectual agenda. So that's just to reinforce, I think, the comments that the two of you have made in your last interventions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Terry and Catherine. And on that note, I will draw this webinar to a close and encourage everyone in the audience to have a look at the special section. We have a rich collection of 11 different pieces, and I'd encourage you to dive into those. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.